For more on the sanctions and the conflict in Ukraine, I'm joined by James Jatras. He's Deputy Director of the American Institute in Ukraine and has extensive foreign policy, security experience, and is a frequent guest on our program. Jim, welcome back.
Thank you.
So let's talk about the extension of these EU sanctions. You and I have talked about this before. Economic sanctions on Russia so far have not deterred Moscow to do anything differently when it comes to Ukraine. So what makes the European Union believe the extension of these sanctions will make a difference now?
It's a very good question, and I don't think there's a very good answer. I think it comes down to they don't know what else quite they can do. Frankly, I think that's the least of our worries right now. I think there are ominous signs of what's going on in Ukraine now, and I think the external security situation outside of Ukraine in Eastern Europe with stepped up deployments of NATO forces in Eastern Europe and then the Russian response to that are actually much more ominous than what's going on with the sanctions.
So what's happening here? Are we entering another Cold War?
Oh, I think we've been in one for some time. I don't think that's even a question anymore. I think the question now is how deep that Cold War is going to get and how much of a risk of a not cold, a hot war there may be if fighting breaks out in Ukraine again and somebody does something stupid, frankly.
And there has been sporadic fighting in eastern Ukraine. This Minsk ceasefire, it seems, hasn't really ended the hostilities. It's a shaky truce. Why is nothing sticking here?
Well, just as you said, it's a truce. It's a ceasefire. It is not a settlement. It is not a peace agreement. And what is necessary there is that Kiev and the Donetsk and Lugansk republics have to talk. They have to reach a political solution. And when all's said and done, Kiev won't talk to those guys. They don't consider them legitimate. They call them terrorists and so forth. I think a ceasefire without a political solution is eventually going to break down, and we will see a start in fighting. And each side, of course, is accusing the other of preparing to do that.
Do you believe both sides share the responsibility here?
Yes, of course. I don't know if they necessarily share the responsibility equally, but I must say as an American, my bigger worry is when we see things like Defense Secretary Ashton Carter going to Berlin and going to Estonia and then putting armored brigade in Eastern Europe in a place where we said we would not deploy heavy weapons. And then the Russians respond by saying, we're not going to target those areas. We're going to send more, we're going to have more ICBMs targeted against the United States, against us here at home. I think it shows how we are not being made safer here because of these policies. So
what's the end game here, Jim? What's going to happen?
If we just keep going along like this, nothing good is going to happen. I think we're getting farther away from a political settlement. We need to stop the empty rhetoric. We need to stop the mechanical things like just renewing sanctions, which, as you point out, are not improving the situation at all, and actually start to communicate, to talk about what the legitimate interests both sides.
But there have been talks, but the talks don't seem to bear any fruit.
That's right, because I think part of the problem is, too, is that behind the Europeans, and of course, when we talk about the Normandy format, we're talking about the Germans, the French, the Ukrainian government, and the Russians. What is the role of the United States here? And I think, unfortunately, it is not a very positive one. It's simply, I think, more threats and more pushing the Europeans to take a confrontational policy, as with renewal of the sanctions. I don't think that's constructive. I don't think it's in the American interest.
Do you think it's just the Americans, or is it also European nations on the same side as the United States in this case?
I think it's some of the European countries, primarily the Baltic states and Poland. I don't think it is so much the publics in places like France and Germany. And even in the United States, there clearly are splits within the American government. For a while, especially when Secretary Kerry had gone over to Russia a few weeks ago, it looks like we're starting to pull back. But then when Mr. Obama went to the G7, suddenly we were back to the inflated rhetoric again. So I don't know what's going on internally within our country.
All right. Well, we'll leave it at that. Jim Jatras, we certainly appreciate your time and perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.